We're Team 3. Our presentation is on Apple and how Steve Jobs was able to dodge Apple's stock backdating scandal of 2001. This is presented to you by Marley King, Kaylee Kubasta, Colin McCreary, Sabrina Shiftar, William Smith, and myself, Justin Collis. Thank you. Hi class, my name is Justin Collis of Team 3. Here's a brief history of our case. In 2001, former Senior Vice President and General Counsel of Apple, Nancy Heinen, covered up 2 instances of backdating, one of 4.8 million shares for Apple's executive team and another 7.5 million for Jobs himself. Along with Heinen, former Chief Financial Officer Fred Anderson was also charged with the cover-up because, according to the SEC's press release, Anderson should have noticed Heinen's efforts to backdate the executive team grant, but failed to take steps to ensure that Apple's financial statements were correct. He later settled with a payment of $3.5 million to the SEC. Mark J. Fagan, Associate Regional Director of the SEC's San Francisco Regional Office, stated Heinen and Anderson failed in their duties as gatekeepers and caused Apple to conceal millions of dollars in stock option expenses. Steve Jobs was able to avoid implications by the SEC for his cooperation with the SEC's investigation and his claims that he was unaware of the dealings of Heinen with no evidence to the contrary. In the end, Heinen paid $2.2 million without admitting liability, and she and Anderson resigned. I'm now going to pass the presentation on to Marley to talk about the definitions of backdating and option spring loading. All sources are in the final slide. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Marley, and I wanted to introduce what option backdating is. The definition is the use of hindsight to change the grant date or exercise price to be on the date of the lowest stock price of the year. So what happened in this case is that 7.5 million shares of Apple were sold at a price of $18.30 when the price should have actually been $21.10. This led to a $20 million taxable charge that was not reported as income. In an interview with Steve Jobs, when they asked him why this happened, he said that it wasn't about the money and more or less that he wasn't getting recognized by his peers, and he thought he was actually doing a pretty good job when all these shares of Apple went out and were getting sold.
Now we will discuss the various individuals who were affected by this situation. First and foremost, Apple Incorporated stockholders were impacted as total profits were inflated by about $20 million. This made Apple's stock seem increasingly better than it actually was, which could have caused confusion among stockholders. Additionally, Steve Jobs was negatively impacted by the situation as he was originally thought to be a part of the conspiracy. He was eventually exonerated due to never actually exercising his stock options. Apple executives Nancy Heinen and Fred Anderson were both relieved of their duties at Apple Incorporated and had files charged against them regarding their participation in the scheme. Lastly, it is important to consider how the situation affected the SEC and the government. The SEC had to spend time and resources conducting an investigation of the incident. Initially, the government missed out on a significant amount of money due to the lack of proper recording from the stock backdating. The issue was ultimately rectified. However, it is clear that many individuals are negatively affected when situations such as this occur.
For the outcomes, the so-called stock option backdating scandal has ensnared many high-tech companies, triggering scrutiny from regulators, resignations, and revised financial results. The company took $84 million in charges to correct its accounting. The Justice Department concluded that its investigation into Heinen, Apple, and other executives would not result in criminal charges. The SEC sued Heinen and Fred Anderson, the company's former chief financial officer, over their alleged involvement. Heinen is charged with, among other things, violating the anti-fraud provisions of the Securities Act of 1933 and the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. lying to Apple's auditors and violating prohibitions on circumventing internal controls. The Commission is seeking injunctive relief, disgorgement, and money penalties against Heinen, in addition to an order barring her from serving as an officer or director of a public company. Anderson, without admitting or denying the allegations in the Commission's complaint, has agreed to a permanent injunction for further violations of the anti-fraud, reporting, internal controls, and other provisions of the federal security laws. Anderson also will disgorge approximately $3.5 million in ill-gotten gains and prejudgment interest representing the in-money portion of the executive team options grant that Anderson exercised, and will pay a civil penalty of $150,000. Steve Jobs was exonerated. Apple said because he didn't understand the relevant accounting laws, he did nothing wrong. So he was let go from this situation. The commission also announced that it would not bring any enforcement action against Apple, based in part on its swift, extensive, and extraordinary cooperation in the commission's investigation. Apple's cooperation consisted of, among other things, prompt self-reporting, an independent internal investigation, the sharing of the results of that investigation with the government, and the implementation of new controls designed to prevent the recurrence of fraudulent conduct.
The executives at Apple could have taken action to prevent this case by doing the following. They should not have covered up the backdating of these stocks and instead reported it on their taxes and used it as a tax-deferred compensation for Steve Jobs. Then Jobs should have reported this as a taxable income on his personal taxes. This would have been well within the legal limit for them to still backdate the stocks and quickly make money. This is, of course, only after they paid their fair share in taxes on that income. Nancy and Fred needed to properly account for the backdating in their earnings. This way, their stock prices could reflect the correct price. And when the SEC asked questions, they would be able to show them the money trail.
After discussing the case, we just wanted to keep some of these questions in mind. Do you believe that this was the correct decision made from a business standpoint? Why or why not? Next, was this decision made ethically? And lastly, we wanted to look at how Steve Jobs was exonerated from the charges when the investigation showed he never actually exercised those options. Do you think this was because he held himself to his own personal ethical philosophy, or maybe just because he knew of the ramifications?